I'm well aware that many of you have no idea who I am. And so thank you for showing up out of a spirit of pure curiosity. I think it speaks very, very well of you. That I know there's some really, really big names at the festival, and I feel very honored to be among them. So thanks for coming. Who am I? So a few things. I write a column called The Undercover Economist for the Financial Times. That's the pink newspaper that's really good. I recommend it. Thank you, sir. The second thing is I present BBC Radio. So I present a show for the BBC World Service called 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. I present a show for BBC Radio 4, all about numbers and how we think about numbers and how numbers sometimes lead us astray and sometimes help us understand the world. And I also have a podcast with a gentleman called Michael Lewis and a gentleman called Malcolm Gladwell called Cautionary Tales, which is all about things going wrong, sometimes in tragic ways and sometimes in amusing ways, and what we can learn from them. So in between all of that, I try and write a few books. And I'm going to talk about what I learned writing one of them. So that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to say is thank you to Rancho Mirage, to the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, to Jamie and the rest of the festival organizers. Thank you. Round of applause for Jamie, please. Thank you. So Jamie emailed me probably 18 months ago and suggested that I fly across the world from Oxford, England, to come to Rancho Mirage. Where's that? It's near Palm Springs. I've kind of heard of Palm Springs. Is that like Palms Beach, or is it different? I don't know. And so it's been a huge journey for me, and I realized it's only possible to fly in someone like me from a very long way away with the support of really devoted readers and the angels and all the people who've supported this festival. So thank you very much to all of you. I feel very fortunate to be here. So I said I wasn't a fan of long preambles, so clearly I'm a total hypocrite. Let me talk about this book of mine, 50 Inventions That Shaped the Modern Economy. I don't know whether you can see the slide or not. Oh, I'm gonna put. I can see a slide. Is there a slide anywhere? There's a slide there. Oh, there's. Okay. Feel free, by the way, to put the camera back on me. It's just a pack shot. You know, you don't need to look at that. You can put the camera back on me. But I'm not going to talk about the book as such. I'm going to talk about what I learned when I was working on it. This was a project originally for the BBC where I picked 50 different inventions that I found interesting. Not the most important inventions, not the most obvious inventions, but the inventions that I felt had something to teach us. There were stories behind these inventions. And people ask me, well, how did you choose them? I chose them because I thought they were interesting. That's the only criteria. So what did I learn while I was doing this? I think it feels like an important question because at this moment, we are asking big questions about what technology does and how it shapes our society. And we're coming up with a very wide range of answers. And for all our understandable focus on politics and political debate, very often it is technology that really shapes how we live, how our economy grows, how our society works. So the answers to these questions matter. And when you talk to economists, they're really in two camps. There's one group that says, look at the progress of computers, you look at the progress of artificial intelligence. It's really possible that after about 2 centuries of people falsely worrying that the robots are going to take the jobs, it is actually possible they might do it this time. And people who have thought really hard, really looked at the data, really looked at history, making a very compelling case that this could happen. At the same time, there are equally expert people, equally persuasive, equally compelling, who will look at the data and say, the unemployment rate is at record lows. Productivity growth is extremely disappointing. We seem to be in the middle of a technological slowdown. If the robots are going to take the jobs, will they please hurry up and do it? Because we need a few more robots around here. And so there's the puzzle between these two views. And I've been studying this debate for years, and I still don't know the answer. But this is the question that really illuminates a lot of debate. So trying to understand how technology works and how it shapes our lives, I think it's not just a matter of curiosity, although of course curiosity is the most important thing. The answers to these questions, even if we don't know what the answers are, the answers to the questions really matter. So, I said I would tell you what I learned working on this book. I learned that we make two big mistakes when we're thinking about how technology works, the impact that technology has. I want to talk about the mistakes because mistakes are always fun. So let me just show you an image from one of my favorite movies. This is an image from Blade Runner. And some of you may have seen the film. When it came out, the early 1980s, I was too young. It's a pretty graphic, hard-hitting, punchy film. It still stands up. Still a good film. But if you look at the image I showed you of what appears to be a beautiful woman smoking a cigarette, which, by the way, hopefully you're old enough to know better. Do not do this. It looks cool in the movies. It's a very bad idea. This is not a beautiful woman smoking a cigarette. This is a machine. It's a robot. The robot's name is Rachel. Rachel is a replicant. And a replicant is a kind of organic robot that is indistinguishable from a human, with a mind that is indistinguishable from a human. Rachel believes herself to be human. Spoiler alert. She thinks she's human. She's not. In fact, it takes a specialist, played by Harrison Ford, our hero, Rick Deckard, takes a specialist with special equipment to tell the difference between this artificial creature, this piece of technology, and a human being. And indeed, so sublime, so seductive is Rachel that Deckard, the man whose job it is to retire rogue replicants, when he meets Rachel, he falls in love with her, or at least he has certain urges towards her. It's not entirely clear, but he's got strong feelings. And you see here, this is Deckard calling Rachel up, because what do you do when you want to date a robot? The answer is you do what you do when you want to date anybody. You phone them up. And this being the future, this being a future of incredible technology, where we have artificial intelligence, where we have these synthetic humans indistinguishable from the real thing, Deckard phones her up on a payphone on the wall of a bar. There's something wrong with it. So if we have a look at the image again for a moment. So it's like, because this film was made in the 1980s, it's set in Los Angeles, you can see it's got graffiti on it. Okay, but of course it's a video phone, not a purely audio phone, but this is a phone attached to the wall of a bar, and of course she says no and hangs up. You can see the font of the future. By the way, this film is set in 2017. 2017? Yeah. No, 2019. Set in 2019. So there's this weird divergence here. This unbelievably sophisticated technology, Rachel, the organic robot, and the absolute lack of progress in anything else. They do have flying cars, but apart from that, everything's the same. There's this amazing lack of imagination about what else might change. And I don't want to criticize Blade Runner and the makers of Blade Runner, because Blade Runner's a great movie, and just in terms of storytelling, you can't change everything because then the audience have no frame of reference. They don't understand what's going on. But I do think it's revealing that you can conceive of a society where you have human-level artificial intelligence, where you have perfect, flawless genetic engineering, and yet if you want to make a phone call, you put coins into a box on the wall of the bar. So what's going on here? What is the basic mistake here? Sure, the mistake is partly that we're trying to see into the future, and it's hard to see into the future. It's complicated. But that's not just, I think, not the fundamental mistake. I think the fundamental mistake is very common. It's an obsession with the most complex technology we can envisage. If if a technology would not have made our parents gasp and say, this is magic, this is sorcery, how does it work? If a technology doesn't do that, we don't think it's technology. Well, that's a big mistake. If we view all technology as incredibly sophisticated, as incredibly complex, we're going to profoundly misconceive the way that technological change works. An example, you want an example. Let me give you an example. This is, of course, the Gutenberg Bible. And when I worked on the book, and I went around, I talked to economists, to historians, to technologists, scientists, and I said, well, what should I put in the book? Everybody said, the Gutenberg printing press. You must put the Gutenberg printing press in the book. I didn't put the Gutenberg printing press in the book. So why not? Let's have a look at the printing press again, the Bible again. So this is this remarkable object. You look at these dense black columns of text written in Latin. The illustrations are hand drawn, but artisanal, organic illustrations by monks. But the Latin text, this is made by a machine. This is a remarkable technology. But when I look at it, what do I see? I see paper. No one ever gets excited about the paper. But the thing is, you can't have this without paper. I mean, well, strictly speaking, you can. You can have parchment. Parchment is made of animal skin, sheepskin or cow skin. You can make parchment, and you can print onto parchment. And in fact, Gutenberg did print some of his Bibles onto parchment shortly before he went bankrupt and lost control of the printing press, because the economics don't work on parchment. I did the maths, because I'm a geek. I'm a proud geek. I did the maths. If you want to do a print run of Bibles, not a huge print run, maybe 2,000 Bibles, you need 250,000 sheep to make your 2,000 Bibles. Yeah, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you could say, well, let's just print 50. We don't have to print 2,000. But if you're just going to print 50, what is the point of having a printing press? It's easier to just handwrite the things. So the economics of printing demands paper. Now, the history of paper I find fascinating. It's my absolute favorite invention in the book. So it was invented in China. A lot of things were invented in China about 2,000 years ago. It was initially used for wrapping stuff up, but then they realized it's kind of cool because it's cheaper than silk and it's lighter than wood, and you can write on it. And it arrived in the Islamic world around 1,300 years ago. And Islamic culture had a really thriving literate culture with no printing. It was all handwritten, but mass literacy. And then the technology sat on the fringes of Europe, and it was partly a weather thing. How do we make paper that doesn't go moldy in European weather? But that was a solvable problem. The real problem is that Europeans just weren't very interested, because most of us couldn't read or write. And the main demand for a writing surface is to make Bibles out of. And I don't want to go into too much detail with the manufacturing process of paper. It does involve urine and sort of stinky rags. And so it's quite a dirty process. It's the first industrial process in Europe making paper. So if you're proposing you're going to make a Bible out of stinky, cheap paper, that's almost offensive. That's like saying, oh, I've thought of a cheaper way to make a crown for the king. We could make it out of lead or pewter instead of making it out of gold. Well, yeah, that would be cheaper, but what's the point of cutting corners if you're making a crown for the king? The same thing with the Bible. It's a holy object. There are very few of them. Every single one is handwritten. Who wants a cheap Bible? Pointless. And paper only came into Europe because there was a commercial culture arriving around it. So the Italian merchants starting to use it for contracts and for letters and for accounts. And so you get the first water-driven paper mills in Fabriano in Italy. You can still buy beautiful, beautiful paper in Fabriano with the fast rushing mountain streams coming down and driving these hammers that are pulping these cotton rags and the urine. And they're making, it was sounding beautiful for a second, wasn't it? And they're making paper. And paper slowly spreads through Europe as an everyday commercial thing. And it arrives in Mainz, in what is now Germany, in the late 1300s. And within half a century, Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press. Because there's absolutely no point in mass-producing writing until you can mass-produce a writing surface. So this is the first principle, you might say, of understanding technological change. It's the paper principle. So once something has become cheap enough to make toilet paper out of, then it's cheap enough to change the world. Yeah, paper is everywhere. It's not just in the books. We print on it. We decorate our walls with it. Receipts, toweling. You go to the restrooms here, wash your hands, dry your hands on paper, throw it away. It is completely ubiquitous, and it is ubiquitous because it is cheap. Not because it is complicated. It's 2,000 years old. It is ubiquitous because it is cheap, and it is still important. And my argument is that one of the things that we miss about technological change is we miss the cheap stuff. Cheap, simple stuff changes the world. Yeah, sure, I'm excited about computers. I'm a nerd. Computers are interesting. But give me the cheap stuff, and I'll show you the stuff that is really going to make a contribution while being widely overlooked. Let me give you a couple of other examples. So here's the first time you see this picture, you're thinking, those are not very nice gentlemen. This is not a picture of what you think it is. This is not the Klan. This is, these guys are cutting barbed wire. And they mask their faces because they do not wish to be seen cutting barbed wire. Barbed wire. Well, that's an intriguing invention. So where did that come from? Well, in the 1860s, I don't want to come here and lecture you on American history, and I do apologize in advance for doing so. But so Abraham Lincoln signs into force the Homesteading Act. He's trying to shift the center of gravity away from the South and towards the Midwest and the West. So move the center of population, move the center of the American economy, shift it away. And so he says, look, you just show up in the Midwest, put some fence around some land. Yeah, there's some people who were there first. Don't worry about them. Put some fence around the land and farm that land for 5 years, and then it's yours, the Homesteading Act. So all these settlers show up in the Midwest, and there's a problem. There's not enough wood. You need the wood for firewood. You need the wood for building. You can't be building fences out of wood. It's far too expensive. So you could just put up ordinary wire, but the longhorn cattle are just going to barge right through that, destroy your crops. So this is an interesting lesson. We talk a lot about property rights and the importance of property rights in economics, and property rights are super important. But there's property rights that you have legally, and there's property rights that you have practically, because you actually have the ability to enforce those property rights. If the longhorn cattle are not paying attention to President Lincoln, okay, they're going to come and destroy your crops. So this is an example of an invention, barbed wire, an invention that everybody knew was necessary. They just didn't know how to do it. Some inventions, like the laser, famously, people create it and they go, I wonder what we can do with this. Must be something. But barbed wire, we knew we needed barbed wire. And 2/3 of all the patent applications for fencing were coming out of the Midwest of America. 2/3 of all patent applications globally for fencing were coming out of the Midwest for a few years. And then a gentleman called J.F. Glidden from DeKalb, Illinois, which is also where Cindy Crawford is from. J.F. Glidden gets a patent for what is recognizably modern barbed wire. You'd still recognize it today. You have a string of wire, you have the sharp bits wrapped around it, then you have another string of wire, and you twist one end, and they twist around each other, and that stops the barbs moving backwards and forwards, and it's that simple. And 10 years after he got that patent, the US made 240,000 miles of barbed wire. Enough to go around the Earth 10 times, because this was solving a problem for people. It's just fencing. It's just fencing. We had fencing beforehand. We had the Great Wall of China. We knew how to build a wall a very, very long time ago, but this was a way to do it cheaply. And again, it was the cheapness of it that changed the world. Here's another example. This graph is from the Financial Times, the best newspaper in the world. This is the price of solar power. And actually, I apologize, because this graph is now 4 years old. So now, you live in the desert. Like, you have sun. We still struggle to imagine that solar power can work. But it's come from nowhere. Solar power has come from nowhere. It's come from nowhere really, really fast. To the extent now that Nevada casinos are willing to pay millions of dollars purely to not have to purchase power on the agreements they signed with the local utilities. It's not just that the solar power is cheap. It's that I will pay millions of dollars not to have to buy the fossil fuel power because I can just plug in to the electric grid. What's driven this? You might think, oh, there must be some super cool technological breakthrough. No, it's just learning by doing. This fall in this graph that I showed you, it's just learning by doing. Bigger factories, more practice, more specialized tools, more attention to how do we pack this stuff effectively, more attention to how do we install it, snap together panels. Used to take a crew of 4 people, a couple of days to install solar on your roof. Now it's 2 or 3 people and it takes a couple of hours. This is the technology that gave us Ikea furniture applied to solar panels. And actually, it's a very old idea, learning by doing. It was originally identified in the aerospace industry. A gentleman called T.P. Wright in the 1930s. The second plane is 20% cheaper than the first plane. The next 2 planes are 20% cheaper than the second plane. The next 4 planes, they're 20% cheaper than the third and the fourth plane. Every time you double output, the price falls by about 20%. And some Oxford academics just down the road from me have studied these learning by doing effects. And they found that absolutely ubiquitous. Any products you care to name, the percentage varies. But everything from batteries to beer exhibits learning by doing. And the thing about solar power is, when I looked at this in 2016, 99% of all the solar power cells ever made had been made between 2010 and 2016. Yeah? There was no solar industry before 2010, effectively. And there's this sudden ramping up, and it's continued and continued. And we're just learning to do it cheaply because practice makes perfect. And the same thing, by the way, is true of batteries. So this is a completely transformative technology. And again, there's nothing especially complicated. It's a very predictable thing. You just build more, they get cheaper, people want more, gets cheaper again, people want more, gets cheaper again. But my favorite example, this is one for the real economics nerds. My favorite example is the shipping container. So the shipping container has done more to lower trade costs, more to fuel globalization than the WTO, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, NAFTA, any trade agreement. I'm an economist. Like, we like trade agreements. Okay, we like dealing with foreigners and getting to sell them stuff and getting to buy stuff from them. We economists are in favor of that, but I think we exaggerate the importance of the trade deal. Very often, this is driven by changes in technology, the cell phone, the internet, the barcode. Don't get me started on the barcode. Come and find me afterwards. I'll tell you about the barcode. Amazing. And the shipping container. And the shipping container, when you think about it, this technology was really introduced in the late 1950s by an entrepreneur called Malcolm McLean. This is 1850s technology, not 1950s technology. It's a steel box. It's corrugated to make it stronger. How complicated is that? Well, we're spending a lot of time taking stuff and putting it on a truck, and then the truck drives to the port, and then we take it off the truck, and then we load it on the ship, and then the ship goes to another port. We take it off the ship, and we put it on a train, and the train drives, and then we take it off the train, we put it on a truck. Why don't we just put it all in a box and just move the box? It's radical, it's amazing. But of course, McLean wasn't the first person to think of this. The idea of putting the stuff in a box and moving the box, this goes back to the early 20th century. But what McLean realized is you need to get the whole system going. You need the trains to adapt, you need the trucks to adapt, you need the ships to adapt, you need the ports to adapt, you need the rules to adapt, you need the logistics systems to adapt, you need the unions to adapt. And he managed to get all of those things working, often by breaking the rules. I mean, we forget now that American logistics was so regulated back then. It just wasn't legal to start up a trucking line and serve a particular route. You had to prove that there was a need for the route, and you wouldn't sort of spoil the business of the people who already served the route. You couldn't own a railroad and a trucking company. You couldn't own a railroad and a shipping line because maybe it's anti-competitive. Well, that's an important consideration. But for McLean, I have to change the shipping line and I have to change the trucking company. So he produced all these clever legal maneuvers to make this happen. He also borrowed a lot of money. He took a lot of risk. He eventually, much later, went bankrupt. But he gave us this systemic change, which is what was necessary to make the shipping container work. So the shipping container, another example of the paper principle. It changes the world, not because it's complicated, but because it's cheap. But that leads me into the second thing I said at the beginning of my remarks. We make two mistakes when we think about technology. The first mistake is we're focusing on whatever's super complicated, whatever's super new, whatever's super sophisticated, and which can be important, but we don't pay attention to the stuff that's simple and cheap, which is just as important. The second mistake we make is we think about the invention and we don't think about the system. So the shipping container only works if it's part of systemic change. So let me give you another example of that. I wanted to show you, this is not going to make a lot of sense to some of you. Well, it'll make sense in a moment, but Tomorrow's World, this is a classic BBC TV program I used to watch when I was a child, which was on for decades. And it was a show about how technology what was coming down the track in terms of technology. And I want to show you, could we maybe get the slide on the screen for a second? So this is Tomorrow's World. I'm going to show you a short film, 90 seconds, about what the office of the future is going to be like from the perspective of 1967.
Nice people. Ah, my office. The perfect office. Perspex desk, no in tray, no out tray, no phone, no filing cabinets, no clutter. Quiet, cool, very efficient. I need never get out of this chair. That'll be nice. No distractions. Just me and the work. Alone and efficient. Alone. Wonder if anybody wants me. Nobody to ask.
Messages.
Well, BJ39 will know. After all, it works for me. I don't even have to go to it. Much better than a human being. Tireless and efficient. Anything I want, it brings.
So, this is what the Office of the Future looked like 53 years ago. I was going to say that they got every single thing wrong. Everything. But actually, I think there's one thing they got right, which is the moment you sit down at your desk and you're faced with actual work, the first thing you're going to do is distract yourself by pressing a button. That they got right. They got that one right. But apart from that, they got everything wrong. And why fundamentally did they get it wrong? Because what you saw was an office of the future that had no social change, no organizational change. It was exactly like the office of 1967, except the desk is made of plastic, and there's a sort of computer thing on a desk that moves. So there's this kind of technology, and the technology is nonsense, but it doesn't matter. But the technology is placed into the context of a 1967 office with a typing pool of young, unmarried women, deferential to the boss who's in a suit and tie, and of course he's got the corner office, and they're out there in the typing pool. And there's no sense of any sort of social change at all in this vision of the future. We've just taken whatever fever dream of a technology people had in the 1960s and said, right, well, we're going to put that in our current office. That's never how technological change works. But very often, it's how we think about it. As we see our lives, the way we behave, the way we interact with people, our political institutions, our organizations, the office, we see that and we imagine that what technology does is it just drops in and it replaces one little bit of what we do and nothing else changes. So this is similar to the Blade Runner problem we had, where you have artificial humans, and yet people are still making calls from payphones. So we always, or almost always, adapt to take advantage of the new technology. And the adaptation process is not always pleasant, but it always happens. It's usually necessary. And we've proved to be very adaptable in contorting ourselves to make the technology work for us, or in being contorted, because you work for an organization, you have to do what the boss of the organization says. So let me give you an example of this. This is a famous example in Nerdland, but you beautiful and sophisticated people, you may not spend time in Nerdland, which I do, so I will bring you news of this example. So this is a photograph of a factory in about 1880. And the thing to see about this is that all the workers in this factory are drawing power from a drive shaft on the ceiling. I told you this was Nerdland, okay? They're drawing power from a drive shaft on the ceiling via these belts that come down. And so everything they do is defined by their relationship with the drive shaft. The drive shaft is going right along the ceiling, and it goes out of the building, and then there's another building next door which has got a coal-powered steam engine, and it's driving the drive shaft. And that is how a factory was. And if you had asked experts in technology and manufacturing design around about 1870, what's going to change in this picture? What is going to change American manufacturing? They would have said electricity. This is a steam-powered drive belt. This is a steam-powered factory. What is going to change is electricity. But what actually happened was that factory owners would remove the coal-fired steam engine, and they'd replace it with a big old electric motor. Edison is selling electricity down the wires. You can buy electricity from Mr. Edison. Westinghouse is designing super efficient turbines and super efficient electric motors. You replace the old steam engine, you put in the big electric motor, and nothing else changes. And do you know what happened to productivity? Nothing. Yeah? People were like, why are we bothering with this stuff? I thought electricity was supposed to be awesome. And it was a little bit less coal dust, which is good if you're making fabrics, but basically it didn't make a huge difference. Then, around about the end of the First World War, was a change in the immigration regime. And it became harder to recruit workers. And so factory owners started going, we need to rethink how we do this. We're going to have to hire fewer staff, pay them more, train them more. And they started to realize, well, you could ask staff to take more responsibility. And actually, you know what? These electric motors, the thing about an electric motor is you can have 100 small electric motors instead of one big one. You can't have 100 small steam engines instead of a big one because it's very inefficient. But you can have 100 small electric motors. They get power through the wires. Well, that means that drive shaft, we can get rid of that drive shaft. Everyone can have their own electric motor at their desk. Get rid of the drive shaft. Oh, hang on. That means you could build a factory with skylights, or you could have cranes in the roof to help people move stuff around, or maybe both. Also, we don't have to organize the factory around proximity to the drive shaft. We can spread out. You used to have 2 or 3 story factories with all of these machines churning all at the same time, and these huge drive shafts, and everything is being lubricated by these drip oilers, and you get your sleeve caught in and you get nasty, and everything's crammed in around the drive shaft. But with the electric motors, you could spread out. and you can organize the factory around the flow of product. This is the first process, this is the second process, this is the third process. Doesn't matter whether it needs a lot of power or a little bit of power. You just arrange it in a logical way. You can start having a production line because you have the product moving between people. None of this is possible with a centralized power source and the drive shafts. So it turns out that electricity did revolutionize American manufacturing, but it didn't do it in the 1880s. It did it in the 1920s. And in order to unlock the technology, you needed to change who you hired, how you paid them, how you trained them, where they sat, the building they sat in, the technology that they were using, and the workflow process. After you've done all that, technology is brilliant. So it's organizational change that unlocks the power of this technology. Now, this is a very old example. This is 100 years old. What could it possibly teach us about today? Well, much more recently, an economist called Erik Brynjolfsson, who's very famous for writing books about artificial intelligence these days, but about 20 years ago, Erik Brynjolfsson and his colleague Lauren Hirt studied American business in the 1990s. And what they were interested in was the process of technological change. If an American business got a load of computers in, this is a graph. I apologize for the complexity of this graph. Let me just explain what this graph is. So if you move this way, that is more computers. If you move back, that's a reorganization. It's more decentralization. And you move up, it's more money. OK? Now I have your attention. So this is what they found. What is this graph basically showing? It's showing if you get the computers in and you don't reorganize, you don't make any money. If you reorganize and you don't get the computers in, you don't make any money. If you don't reorganize and you don't get the computers in, that's not the worst thing you could do. But the real money comes from reorganizing and getting the computers in. In order to make the technology work, you have to reorganize. And I'm very mindful of the fact that with manufacturing, with electrification, it took 40 years. Now, I don't know when we should be measuring from. Should we be measuring from the invention of the computer in the 1940s, or the World Wide Web in the early 1990s, invented by an Englishman called Tim, just saying? Or should it be the smartphone, 2007? Or what is it that we're looking at? But the point is, whatever technology you're looking at, it can take a long time to figure out how to use it. And arguably, the impacts of the web, the impacts of the smartphone, the impacts of the Internet of Things, RFID sensors, machine learning, we're just beginning to get to grips with how these things might reshape our economy. What we do know is that when they do it, it will be because we change. We adapt. Machines aren't adaptable. We are. We're always the ones who find ourselves bending to fit. May not like it, we may like it, but that's the way it always seems to work. So at the beginning of my remarks, I talked about this big debate about what are the robots going to take the jobs? And I said I don't know the answer, and I haven't figured it out in the last 30 minutes, I can assure you. But I think that the lessons that I've learned and the lessons that I hope I've been able to share with you do sharpen the question a little bit. So when we think about the machines taking the jobs, we tend to think about this sort of super scary vision of the Terminator or HAL 9000. I just have a slightly disconcerting image of HAL 9000, these super intelligences that are going to take over our lives and take over everything and destroy us, or at the very least, force us into lives of complete luxury and indolence where they do all the work. And I don't know, that seems to me to be making these two basic mistakes. We're focusing too much on the incredibly sophisticated stuff, and we're not thinking about how we are going to change to adapt to them. So let me think about a really interesting technology. It's the robot accountant. Now, when I say robot accountant, you are now thinking either Arnold Schwarzenegger walks in and you're working in an accounting firm and you get there and there's Arnie in a leather jacket with an Uzi on the desk, and you sort of back slowly away. You come back to get your things later. Or you're thinking maybe C-3PO. He might make a good accountant, right? I know he's a protocol droid. That's the image of a robot accountant. But I can tell you, that's not what a robot accountant looks like. Do you want to know what a robot accountant looks like? You go to your Windows computer, you fire up Microsoft Office, and there's this green X for Microsoft Excel. You just click on the button, and up comes a spreadsheet. And that's a robot accountant. And it was invented in 1979, VisiCalc, the first digital spreadsheet, by a lazy guy who wondered why he had to spend all his time adding up rows and columns on pieces of paper. These big pieces of paper, by the way, they were called spreadsheets, big pieces of paper. Why? Every time something changes, I have to recalculate everything? This is crazy. I can get a computer to do this. So he was called Dan Bricklin. He programmed Microsoft Excel. And Microsoft Excel, it's not very sexy, is it? It's not very complicated. But it is a robot accountant because it lowers the task of arithmetic. And it lowers the task of arithmetic that a particular kind of accountant did, the accounting clerk. Of course, you call them clerks, so I'll translate. So the accounting clerks. So there were 400,000 accounting clerks in the US at the time, and basically all of them were out of work in about 5 years. But we now have more accountants than ever before, because those people did different jobs. So obviously you don't add up rows and columns. What's the point of that? But the accountancy profession still expanded, and the job of being an accountant became much more interesting. So there's a situation where it wasn't complicated, it wasn't sexy, it's just Microsoft Excel. It completely reshaped an industry. It didn't destroy any jobs. We have more jobs in accountancy than we did before, but it changed the way we did those jobs. It changed the kind of things that accountants did. They started doing financial forecasting, they started doing scenarios, they started doing strategic advisory work. And it made being an accountant a lot more interesting because the machine was doing the most boring part of accountancy. But let me give you another example of really exactly the same dynamic, only with a slightly flipped ending. So I want to show you a photograph of Jennifer. This is not Jennifer, okay? Jennifer is what she's wearing. Jennifer is the headset. So this woman is working in a warehouse, could be for any large company, loads and loads of warehouses around the world. And a few years ago, your job in a warehouse would be you'd have a list. People have ordered stuff online. You have to go around and you have to find out where all the stuff is, pick the stuff, put it in a cart, take it to be packed. And then the Jennifer unit was invented. And the Jennifer unit knows where all the stuff is, knows what you have to pick, knows how you have to pick it. So if, for example, you ordered 13 copies of 50 Inventions that shaped the modern economy from a warehouse, which I would not advise. I'd advise you to buy them here in Rancho Mirage. But say you order 13 copies of 50 Inventions that shaped the modern economy. The Jennifer unit would instruct the picker to go to the shelf and would say, not take 13 copies, take 5 copies. 5. Take 5 more copies. You take another 5. Take 3 more copies. You take another 3. Because the Jennifer unit doesn't trust the humans to count. But you know what the humans can do? They've got eyes, super cool vision, really, really good at spotting things, very subtle hands. Robots really find it hard to pick stuff up. Is it a glass? Is it a book? They crush things, they drop things. Humans are much better at this. But this is a case, it's just like the spreadsheet, except the spreadsheet took away the most boring part of accountancy, whereas the Jennifer unit is taking away the most interesting part of a job that's not very interesting. Like, remembering where the stuff is and getting around the warehouse in an efficient way. No, we don't need your brain, thank you very much. We have the Jennifer unit for that. Just need your hands and your eyes. So when I think about technology, I think about the spreadsheet. I think about the Jennifer unit. I think about paper and barbed wire and the shipping container and solar panels. I think about all the cheap stuff. And I think about the way that we adapt ourselves, sometimes in inspiring ways, sometimes we contort ourselves in order to fit around that technology. And I'm not so worried about the robots taking our jobs. I'm not so worried about the Terminator. I'm not so worried about Rachel, the super intelligent organic robot. I am a little bit worried about Jennifer. I'll be signing books out there. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thanks a lot.